For loops are another option when you would like to repeat a code block multiple times, and they are quite handy. If we look again at a while loop, we can see that we initialize a variable in front of the while loop and change its value inside the while loop. When you have such a setup and only use the variable for the execution of the loop and not outside the loop, you could replace the setup with a for loop. For a for loop we need the for keyword, an initialization statement which initializes a variable, a condition, an updation statement which changes the variable, and then of course we also need a code block that should get executed. Let's look at an example. For the initialization statement, you can write the same initialization code that we also have used for the while loop. Integer counter equals 0. Then for the condition we can also use the same condition that we have used the last time. Counter less than 10. And lastly, for the updation statement, we can use the increment statement that we currently have placed at the end of our while loop. Then you have a complete header for the for loop. As usual, we log the value of the variable inside the for loop, and then after the loop we log that the loop has finished. So what happens when we execute this? When we enter the for loop for the very first time, we execute the initialization statement. So in our case, counter equals 0. So after that, our variable counter is 0 and exists only inside the for loop. We then print the value of counter, which in our case still is 0, and then we already have reached the end of our for loop. When this happens, we jump back up to the updation statement and increase our variable by 1. So now the counter is 1. After we have executed the updation statement, we then check if the condition is still valid. If that is the case, we go back inside the for loop code block and repeat the process until the condition is false. The log shows that we repeat the for loop until our variable was incremented to 10. Since then, our condition is not valid anymore. One thing that you probably already have realized is that after the initialization statement and after the condition statement of a for loop, you have to place a semicolon. What you also can do when using a for loop is that you can leave the initialization statement and updation statement empty, basically recreating the while structure one-to-one. When you do this, you have to ensure that you create the variable somewhere else before the for loop, and you also have to ensure that you change the value somewhere else than the updation statement. However, if you ever feel like you need this structure, because for example, if you want to print the value of counter after the loop has finished, then personally, I would prefer using a while loop, because the design of the for loop is more for keeping the initialization, condition and updation together compact in the header of the for loop. And most of the time you use such a setup if you want to iterate over a certain range, like 0 to 10, for example. However, nothing will stop you from using a structure like this. For today's exercise, I have a simple and short exercise, namely use nested for loops to log the following metrics in your output log. If you have any questions, like always, write them in the comments. Otherwise, see you next time.